Can you hear this now? Yeah, everyone nod if you hear a C major chord. Yes, awesome. Okay, I see some thumbs up. That's great. Yeah, we'll all just hope that that keeps working. Okay, so let me get this pulled up real quick. Share screens again. So you all can see this fine, right? Good. Composing in real time. Let me just give you a little bit of my background as relates to improvisation. I think we'll start there and then get into kind of the nitty gritty about what I wanted to talk about. So I see a lot of young faces in the audience, which is great, a lot of younger students. I was probably about 7 or 8 years old when I first started improvising, and nobody told me that this was something that I might eventually be able to make a career out of. This was something I sort of just stumbled across on my own because it was fun. I liked to do it. I was, like I said, a little kid just playing the piano and trying to figure out what sounds made me happy when I played them. The first music that I started playing was in church, actually, and I would play like hymns and then I would kind of mash them up with popular songs and make, variations on them and stuff like that, just so I could laugh, just so my friends and I could have some fun. And that was the very beginning of my introduction to improvisation. I didn't know that at the time I was doing a very rudimentary and basic version of what J.S. Bach was doing in the end of the Goldberg variations when he wrote a bunch of popular songs into a big choral mashup, essentially, and combining all of these different elements together. But in a way, like, improvisation has always been a part of classical music. So what we're going to look at today is some ways that that these traditions have intertwined over the years. So like I said, I was a little kid, just started playing, and then two really specific things happened as I got older that made me start to take improvising a little more seriously. One of those was discovering some contemporary composers who were writing improvisation into their music. And you'll actually get to hear one of those pieces later on in the recital that I'm going to give for you all later this week. And the other was a session working with a really well-known historical improviser, so someone who improvises in the style of Mozart. And I worked with him for a couple of weeks, and it was so amazing to be around him just to see the things that he could do on the piano. He could play a cadenza fully fledged in the style of Mozart for as long as he needed, or he could just play a set of variations on the spot. And I was just so taken with this ability that he had developed to just play music as if it had already been written, but just on the spot. So I really started to take it a little more seriously at that point and started thinking, oh, I wonder if this is actually something that I can do too. And the more I started reading and the more I started listening to improvisations and doing them myself, the more I began to appreciate how the music that I grew up playing as a student, the music of Bach and Beethoven, Chopin, Liszt, Rachmaninoff, all of these composers that we know so well, how improvisation was an essential part of their musical language because they themselves improvised, and that was how they came up with so many of their ideas, was at the keyboard. And it made me wonder, why don't we teach this? Why don't we learn this skill as Bach once did, as Mozart once did? And it's really actually kind of cool. I was just telling my girlfriend today, it's really cool to see that changing, like literally right now. I think in 2 days' time, another presenter at this festival is going to talk about composing and improvising together. And I was thinking, wow, like 5 years ago, that wouldn't have even been a thing, and certainly would have been a thing 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I first started to improvise. So I think we're all kind of becoming a little more aware that this was always a part of classical music. It's just maybe not been a part of our musical education, or at least it wasn't a part of mine. Okay, so that's kind of my background. as relates to improvisation. I was mostly self-taught, but much of what I've picked up has just come from studying composition and studying composers and kind of the improvising languages of the past as well as the future. So let's see. I had this thought today. If composition is like sculpture, then improvisation is like dance. And I thought these two images rather beautifully illustrate the contrast between them, because on one hand, you have this person, the statue of a person who's sitting there thinking, and he's frozen in that moment. And so we, the audience, get to examine this from every side. You know, if we walk around to the front, we see something different. If we go to the side, we see something different. And we can think about it. We can think about it for 5 minutes. We can think about it for 20 years. And, you know, as long as someone's paying the bill to keep that statue up, we can come back 50 years later and look at it. It'll still be the same. And we'll see something different. And on the other hand, you have this dancer who is caught by the photographer in between movements. You know, she's clearly going somewhere. She can't stand there for 20 minutes, or, you know, she's in motion. She's traveling between places. So the statue, I think, is ruminative in the sense we look at it, we see it, we think back, and we think back on it again. We think, what was the sculptor trying to say to us when they made this person sit the way they do? I think we ask that question all the time when we play a sonata by Beethoven. What was Beethoven trying to say with this chord? Or what was he trying to do with this phrase? It's concrete. We know what Beethoven wrote. He wrote, you know, the beginning of Waldstein is always going to be the same. You know, it's experienced as an unfolding encounter. So when we listen to a piece of music, whether it's, you know, the Fifth Symphony, you know, or if it's a Chopin nocturne, you know, we hear the music and we're taken along on a journey. But the journey is always decided beforehand. It's always complete, and it's balanced with itself. Improvisation, on the other hand, it happens once and then we never hear it again, unless someone is recording it. Or it's subjective. If I play a chord that I just made up on the spot right now, like this chord, what do you feel when you hear that chord? It's something different than I felt, probably. And you might even think, okay, well, that chord sounds like a mess. But maybe I hear it going somewhere else. Or maybe you heard it going there. I heard it going or somewhere else entirely. So improvisation is subjective. We kind of all agree on it together as it's happening. And it's experienced as something that unfolds as it's happening, just like this conversation, where I don't exactly know the next word I'm going to say, but I have an idea, and I think you do too. So in that way, we all participate in the creation of an improvisation together. So I think, like, there's so much written about improvisation. There's so many amazing improvisers. The more I learn about improvisation, the more I respect the amount of work that has gone into this in the past. It's literally hundreds and hundreds of years worth of improvisation just at the piano. And so one of the questions that I'm always trying to answer is, how does this relate back to the music that I study as a classical musician, in quotation marks, classical? So there were a lot of historic keyboard improvisers. We know most of these names. Some of them, I mean, if I tried to include a full list of them all, this presentation would be like 5 hours long, which I don't think any of us want. But there's a few on here that you might not know as well. C.P.E. Bach was the son of J.S. Bach. J.S., of course, was an amazing improviser, but C.P.E. also tried to bring improvisation into the fabric of his compositions. So he tried to write compositions that sounded as much like improvisations as possible. So if we're trying to figure out how C.P.E. Bach might have improvised, we can look at those compositions as a really good resource. Johann Hummel was another one. He was a German composer who, and virtuoso pianist, who was performing around the same time as Mendelssohn, and kind of predated the young romantics by just a little bit. And Hummel was probably the foremost improviser of his time. He might even have been better than Beethoven. And he left behind this long legacy of compositions that we can study and listen to if we want to find out more about how improvisers wrote in the past. I really like historical improvisation. There are some amazing performers and harpsichordists, forte pianists who have studied and made it their life's work to find out how these great composers of the past wrote and improvised. But for me, I've always been particularly interested in kind of the journey that improvised music took and how it relates to the music that we make today. And something really interesting happened at the beginning of the 19th century as we moved away from these improvised traditions of the past to what we are kind of more familiar with today as music. And I included these two pictures because it really illustrates the difference between them. On the left, you have this massive crowd of people, like hundreds and hundreds of people, and on the right, a very, very small, intimate group. And this is essentially how music was being made at the time. So composers like and performers like Franz Liszt and Frédéric Chopin would give these big, big public concerts that were really the first of their kind in Europe. And then they would also play for each other in these small, intimate gatherings. So there were different kinds of languages of music that were evolving at the same time. The big ones, you know, like the sonatas and the fantasy pieces and all of these bigger pieces evolved for these very big rooms and big crowds. And at the same time, there's this very intimate kind of conversational, playful style of music that still existed, where composers and musicians would play for each other for hours on end. And that those practices of music were competing. They lived and breathed at the same time. And I think that Liszt and Chopin didn't see them as being entirely separate. They saw them as essentially two parts of the same thing. I think on the next slide, yeah, there's this amazing quote that I'm going to read from Chopin's pupil, who wrote about the importance of improvisation in Chopin's musical life. He said, "The other day I heard Chopin improvise at George Sand's house. It is marvelous to hear Chopin compose in this way. His inspiration is so immediate and complete that he plays without hesitation, as if it could not be otherwise. But when it comes to writing it down and capturing the original thought in all its details, he spends days of nervous strain and almost terrible despair." So that's a lot of words, but basically he's saying that Chopin would sit at the piano and play fully formed musical ideas, composing as it came to him. But then when he tried to capture those original ideas, something inside of those ideas gave him an immense amount of struggle, and he got really frustrated and disappointed at times because he couldn't always capture something about that original thought. I love this quote because to me it shows a couple of really fascinating things. One, that Chopin and Liszt, their contemporaries, all of the great composers, almost always had some connection to improvisation. And because it shows this very human side to these people. You know, we think of them as having, you know, conceptualized some of the greatest works of art that we know, and they did. But at the same time, they struggled with it mightily, and it wasn't always a straight line from point A to point B. So the other thing I wanted to ask is, what happened to improvisation? Where did it go? You know, if Chopin and Liszt and all of their contemporaries were improvising all the time, then why don't you go to a concert and expect a classical pianist to improvise half of the time, as audiences of the 19th century might have expected? And the answer is really threefold. One, it's hard to sell that as a product. It's really hard to sell an improvisation as easily as it is to sell a piece of sheet music, for example. And at the beginning of the 19th century, there was this very, very large demand for sheet music. It was really the first mass media. Obviously, CDs didn't exist, LPs didn't exist, MP3s certainly didn't exist, but sheet music was really one of the first ways that music was widely disseminated and purchasable, and you could make money off of it. So that's what composers did. They wrote a lot of sheet music. And it was difficult to, write improvisations and sell them in some way. The other was these changes that we already talked about in the social context of public performance. So performances were getting bigger, critics were getting more critical, they had less tolerance for wrong notes, for example, or for ideas that didn't quite pan out the right way. And finally, there were changes in how composers themselves were thinking about music. Like I already said, I don't think that Liszt really saw a separation early on in his career between that private style of performing for just his friends and in the public sphere, playing for hundreds or thousands of people. And someone like Mozart or Bach certainly wouldn't have recognized a difference between this. But I think over time, these composers began to feel as if their music was something more, as if it expressed something that no improvisation could be capable of expressing, because it was, like we said in the beginning, something that was completely thought through before you ever encountered it. And so that's why I call it the work. I think Wagner probably best exemplifies this, because Wagner not only thought about the musical context of his work, but the scenic context of his operas. He wrote his own librettos for operas, so the words, the poetry that were being said, all of these different things, composers were now codifying and prescribing. And so improvisation really wasn't very compatible with that. It's like if you're trying to make a statue dance. And also, there was kind of an egotistical element to it as well. If saying, it might not be as satisfying to listen to a piece of art and realize that the composer, played it through once, improvising it, and then wrote it down. And so, it sort of said more about these composers that they were wanting to, they almost created a mystique around them, a legend, where, the great artistic genius sits at the desk for hours and hours and hours and comes up with these massive, sprawling works of art that only he could have thought through. And so improvisation fell out of favor really by the 1860s and 70s. It wasn't really a commonplace part of public performance, and pianists certainly continued to improvise for each other, but not on the large scale that they were in the early part of the 19th century. Then, of course, there are all of these other things that music is today, besides just European art music. When we look at what improvised music can be today, there are all of these influences. There's jazz, of course, which was really the primary vehicle for improvised creativity in the early part of the 20th century. Popular music, there's, of course, people now who are improvising in historical styles, like in the Baroque styles or classical styles. There's non-Western musical traditions like Indian music, and pretty much any kind of folk music. It involves a huge amount of improvisation. New music written by contemporary composers that is bringing together all of these elements into compositional form. Free improvisation, which I think is distinct from jazz because it kind of focuses on a novel approach to improvising. So just making new sounds on an instrument, like drumming on a piano or playing a violin with a broomstick or something, just trying to think of the most creative and original sounds that you can make on an instrument. And avant-garde composition, I kind of included that because to me, the music from the first half of the 20th century is very different from the music of the second half of the 20th century and how it approaches improvisation. I think like John Cage, for example, the American composer, was famously wrote a piece of music that's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of complete silence, and all of the sounds are indeterminate. And that's very much an improvised composition, but it's also very different from a composition that includes improvisation at an instrument or a piano, something like that. So that's the presentation portion of this lecture. Wow, that was exactly 20 minutes. That's pretty good. So at this point, do you all have any questions or anything of that sort? Let me just stop the share real quick so I can see the chat. Good. If you have any questions, of course, you can just put them in the chat, or you can shout out over top of me and interrupt me. That's fine. Okay.
¿Alguien tiene preguntas, por favor, en el público? ¿Alguna pregunta que tengan hasta el momento? ¿No? Entonces, proseguimos. Ok. ¿Seguro? ¿Nadie? Ok.
If you think of any. Oh, is that someone?
I'm asking. I think,
okay.
Let's continue. Let's continue.
Sounds good. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to do for the rest of the time is kind of talk through my process of improvising and just give you some sense. Basically, I'm giving this presentation as if I were in the audience as a 12 to 18-year-old or even a little older, asking myself, hey, I like to play music that's not written down, but I don't really have any idea of what more I can do with this. So if any of you are out there who are like me as a little kid, then that's great. That's who I'm talking to. So the reason why I call this presentation composing in real time is because, I'm sure some composers would take exception to that, but that's what I really think improvisation is. And so when you're improvising, you're always dealing with all of the musical elements at once and kind of deciding what to do with them. So what are some elements of musical composition? Can someone just shout out one? What's the maybe the best known element of music? Like if you heard this.
Rhythm. William?
Yes, sir.
Rhythm?
Rhythm, absolutely, rhythm. I think rhythm is probably the most important one, right? So, so let me see. Do you all know this tune? Not if you know it. It's familiar, right? You know it? I think we all know it. So the rhythm of Happy Birthday is very, very simple, right? It's just, that's all it is. And then you do it again. And you do it again. You add a note, and then you just do it again. So that's why I think rhythm is the most important element to control as an improviser, because it is so consistent and so recognizable, right? Now that we're all thinking about Happy Birthday, I can play literally any note in that rhythm and it will still sort of remind you of it. Right? Still kind of familiar. We can even take the contour of the melody and completely invert it. And we all know what that is, even though obviously the notes are completely random and they don't really go together. It's still obvious that we're playing Happy Birthday. So rhythm is probably the most important element to control as an improviser. The other reason why rhythm is great is there's so few of them, right? There's so few units of rhythm. In a standard measure of music, you might see a whole note, a half note, a quarter note, an eighth note, 16th note, and maybe a 32nd note. And you're still only talking about 5 or 6 metrical divisions and possible combinations of those durations. And so, for example, measure of standard music might have I've already played like a ton of notes, right? But I've only played a couple of rhythmic durations. I had long notes, slightly shorter notes. Let's see. So that's a shorter note, and then the very short notes. And so that's only 3, right? What's another example? This is great. The beginning of the last movement of Beethoven, Opus 27-1. That's, again, a lot of notes, but there's only 3 different durations inside of that. There's 8 notes, right? Quarter notes, or 8 notes, and then 16 notes. So when you're improvising, just controlling rhythm is the most important thing because it gives you control over thematic material and it gives you control over the listener's ear, most importantly. You're able to tell them what you're playing. Okay, so what's another element of musical composition? I bet Carlos can name them all.
¿Alguien más sabe cuáles son los elementos más importantes de la música aparte del ritmo? ¿Qué quiere decirle de repente al maestro? ¿Alguien sabe cuáles son los elementos de la música aparte del ritmo?
Melodía.
Ajá, melody. Somebody said.
Melody, of course. I mean, what would music be without melody, right? Like, I mean, it's the only thing. I mean, it's the only thing, right? And whenever we think of melody, I find that so fascinating because melody is clearly what stands out in everyone's mind, right? So here's the melody from the Variation series, which I'm going to play in a couple of days. So. Okay. No one would. What is that? Just by itself, it's not. It doesn't have very much to say. So, although melody is what stands out in our minds when we hear music, I don't think that it's as important as we think it is. I think harmony is more important than melody. I think melody grows out of harmony. And the reason I think that is because the expressive potential of this line comes out of the harmonies that support it. Right? And Beethoven in particular does this with his melodies. Things like, well, here's a great example. Like, beautiful, right? Ah, bravo. No, you need the harmony. You need something to give it that emotive energy. So here's what Beethoven does as the great harmonic genius that he was. Already, so this now, so it's what brings the intensity to the thing. Otherwise, we just. And if he were a lesser composer, he would have written something like this. Which is pretty, but it's not. It doesn't quite have the. So melody and harmony are one and the same. They grow out of each other. They support each other. If melody is the leaves on a tree, then harmony is the trunk and the branches that support it. And you can't have one without the other. Leonard Bernstein, talked about this in a series of lectures about how the melody of virtually any Beethoven sonata or any Rachmaninoff symphony is just like one note. And then the harmony is what we imagine, and the harmony is what gives it its strength and its compelling emotional power. So the other thing that really closely relates to melody and harmony is texture, right? We already kind of touched on that with this Beethoven sonata, right? With this melody. What makes it so extremely emotional when Beethoven writes it is a register. It's this heartbeat of a class sort of pulsating underneath. And we can do different things to these textures that really radically alter the character of the music. So, like, for example, if we pick the same melody and we just sort of put it over a waltz bass line, like suddenly it's a completely different piece of music. It's probably not as good as what Beethoven wrote to begin with, but this is how we think of music when we're improvising. Controlling texture, controlling melody, and controlling harmony altogether. Texture is particularly interesting because as we go later in the 20th century, composers started to use texture as a device all of its own. So you get pieces like Debussy, for example, was a composer who did this nonstop. This is the last prelude from Book 2, Fireworks. All this is texture. There's really no music there yet. It's just these running. And as time goes on, he creates this improvisatory portrait of fireworks just out of these textural elements. So if we're improvising, for example, and we come up with a texture that works, like, you know, that's one texture. Right? We can keep going and we can do something different, but that's one texture. Here's another one. So just by creating distinctive textures, we sort of set the compositional engine in motion. And improvising becomes a game where we just decide what the next step is. The foremost rule of improvising is I've thought a lot about improvising and how to teach it. What makes a really good improvisation and how do we differentiate that from a less great improvisation? The most important question to ask yourself, what am I doing with repetition? Am I repeating something or am I doing something different? When it comes to music, repetition is pretty much all there is. Think back to Happy Birthday, right? It's a repeating rhythmic pattern. And we're going to do it again. That's the note. And then, so Happy Birthday is kind of an extreme example because it's all the same. But something that's, let me see. The variation series is a great example of something that changes, but sort of stays the same. So it's the same rhythmic pattern. Go higher. Now we change. In classical music, there are specific rules about when we change. So, you know, it's the same pattern that underlies pretty much any sonata form theme. You have one idea, the second idea, and you do something a little more. So when you're improvising, you're just paying attention to what am I repeating? What am I keeping the same? The great music theorist Adam Neely talks about this in two simple words: repetition legitimizes. If you do anything twice or four times, it starts to sound right. So I'm just going to play random notes. It's really random. There's a lot of, it's not a great sound, but if I do it a bunch of times, it sort of becomes something that we become accustomed to. Stockhausen, the extremely avant-garde German composer, takes this to its logical extreme in, I think it's his ninth piano piece, where it's literally just one repeated chord for about 10 minutes. You just hear it over and over and over again for 10 or 20 minutes. And at the end of it, you have this amazing experience of listening to these one sound just changing over and over again. So those are some of the basics of what underpin successful improvisation. So I thought what I could do, it's actually really challenging because it's not super easy for me to hear this piano over the speakers. So let me see if there's a way I can turn that off. But no, I didn't think so. Oh well, it'll be fine. I thought maybe I could play a couple of improvisations for you and just talk through the process behind them, maybe as I'm going on and maybe not. Sound good? Okay, so I haven't planned any of these pieces out. I'm just kind of going to create them for you on the spot. And the first piece that I'm going to do will just be very short, maybe 30 seconds long, and I'm going to see how much of a musical story I can tell in those brief 30 seconds. Okay, so what I was thinking about while I was playing that was the relationship between B flat and F. The whole thing is kind of like an amen cadence. Right? You go to church, you hear that a lot. So the idea behind a piece like this is getting from one place to the other. So you're kind of feeling very, you know, gloomy and upset, and then over time it works itself out into a more relaxing, calm texture. Let me ask you this: what emotions did you think while you were listening to that? What reaction did you have when you heard it? And maybe Carlos can translate that so that we can all hear what everybody has.
Yes, just give me one minute to translate.
Yeah, of course.
Hola a todos. William pregunta qué emociones, qué reacciones tienen con lo que él ha tocado. Pueden escribir por el chat, yo lo traduzco, ¿ok? A ver qué reacciones tienen con lo que ha tocado, con la música que ha tocado. A ver, ¿quién tiene alguna... Ah, melancholy. Somebody,
Melancholy.
okay, melancholy, yeah. Somebody else?
Right. Yeah.
¿Quién más que quiera decirnos qué siente?
Nice. Let me see. Oh, right, the chat window. Okay, now I can see it. Cool. Yeah, melancholic. I like that. Melancholy is good. Can somebody give me, yeah, mysterious and melancholic. I like it. Yeah, and it felt that way to me too.
Energy to calm.
So calm. Yeah. One of the questions I always ask when I'm improvising is like, why is that calming? Why is it melancholic? I mean, it's certainly not that B flat major or minor or F major is a particularly melancholic key. We can do pretty much anything with any key. Wow, they're just pouring in. I like this. Tranquil, sadness. Yeah. So I think one of the things that makes this melancholic for me is it's not quite sure where it's going. So like, if you start like this is it's built out of B flat major level or B flat minor. It also has a D flat major and then an extra note. So the sound can pretty much go anywhere. It can be major, it can be minor, it can be happy, sad. And I think that sort of mixture is what gives it that melancholic feel. Cool. Can someone give me an emotion that they want me to play in? Like, what's a feeling that that maybe you're feeling right now that you'd like me to play?
Por los que no saben de repente inglés o no entendieron, de repente alguien puede dar alguna emoción, quieren que William toque algo que les evoque una emoción específica. De repente alguien quiere algo, eso él puede improvisar para ustedes. You understand that word or not?
So like energetic and happy. Oh, that person's you are so compatible. Something sad. Let's go with like let's do why don't we do two together? We'll do something that's energetic and then something that becomes sadder. That implies its own sort of emotional transfiguration. Its own journey. Okay. Just so you know, when I play a note on this piano, it takes about half a second to get from the piano to the computer and then back to me. So the sounds that I'm playing are like here half a second later. So it'll be interesting to play faster. We'll figure it out. I always like it when an improvisation has its own kind of internal rhyme. So I started out in D major. I actually did not know where I was going to end up, and then I ended up in D major again at the very end, which is kind of cool. I like it when it works out like that. Yes, chévere. So when you, yeah, thank you. What did you think of happy? Did it feel happy to you? Yeah, maybe. Something sarcastic. Oh, that's a good one. So happiness to me, I think when you look at compositional examples, there are some amazing pieces by Liszt, actually really even going back to Bach, Haydn, Bach, who created these incredibly joyful works. Like I'll play a Gigue for you from the Partita in A minor in a couple of days. And to me, this is just one of the most joyful pieces that Bach wrote. I'm going to play the very beginning for you. I didn't write this. Bach wrote this. Hard to do when I hear it on a delay. That's crazy. But it just has this dancing, vital energy to it. So I tried to bring something similar to this, the happy beginning of the piece. And then I think that when you feel sad, you feel a kind of like stillness. And so chordal, solemn sounds, I think, are appropriate for something like that. Something sarcastic. So one of my favorite composers is Prokofiev, because of the way that he is able to blend, I think, different textures and sounds that are unfamiliar and familiar at the same time, but always in a way that's very witty. So with Prokofiev, he'll take something like a march and just make it like horrible and kind of limping. So like. And so sarcastic element of that for me is, of course, a march is in 4, right? But that was in 5. So, that's a little bit of a surprise. And of course, like with Prokofiev, an angular melody, notes that don't really quite resolve, and then do very suddenly, are all ways of creating new kinds of music. So let me think. The one thing we haven't really touched on is form. The last summer started getting into trying to improvise sonatas, which is a lot of fun because you have to keep track of a lot of different moving musical elements. The most important one being like what key you're in, but also just keeping track of the themes is really complicated. One of the things that I always really try to do when I'm improvising is coming up with very distinctive musical ideas and then referring back to them. So if I'm going to make a piece out of 2 competing musical ideas, I want them to be really, really, really different from each other. Otherwise, I'll just get them confused in my head. So let's say I want to play something in one style and then move into something different. Now that I have this kind of mood set up, I can, we can go back and play it again in a different texture. But if I want to do something different, I'm going to really try to make it as different as I possibly can. So. separate these musical ideas in my head. And then if I refer to either one of them later in an improvisation, then my audience will also be able to keep them straight in their heads as well. Do you have any questions at this point for me? I kind of, I wish that the electronic format didn't create this situation where it's really hard to like perform for each other. Because otherwise I would just play like 10 or 15 minutes of improvs for you after this. But do you guys have any questions, comments, thoughts that you want to share at this time? You can drop them in the chat or.
Maybe I have a question. Maybe what do you recommend to start not a career, but maybe making improvisation, maybe some, when we have to play a Mozart cadenza, for example.
Right. Yeah.
And what we can do to learn how to improvise in that style, I mean, no? Because style, to learn how to improvise in that style.
That's a great question. And honestly, like, as I, I am not an expert in historical performance practice, so maybe I'm the wrong person to ask. But if I were gonna, I definitely would not feel comfortable at this point in time improvising a Mozart cadenza for all of you. But I could probably sketch one out in 5 or 10 minutes and then play something off the sketch, which is probably what Mozart would have done too. And I think there's two things that you can do. The first thing is, obviously, like, as classical musicians, we study the score like crazy. But in order to improvise in a historical style, you have to really, really understand the conventions of the form, what the expectations are. The good news with someone like Mozart is that those conventions are very, very consistent. So, it's always going to end in some kind of like 6/4 going to 5/7 harmony or cadence. So, I don't know, like, this is going to be a little interesting. So let's just see if it forms out. Clearly, we're not at the end of a phrase yet. Now we're there. We heard the cadence, right? And the beautiful thing about classical music and literacy, like Mozart, Haydn, is the textures are so clear that it's very easy to control them compared to, like, trying to improvise a cadenza to Rock 3 or something. So let's see. Maybe I gotta try something in mind because that just sounded exactly like okay. Something in a more historical style, I'm just concentrating on making the textures sound consistent with the style. And that just comes from familiarity with the music, which I'm sure most of us here already have. The other thing is just being aware of what harmonic progressions would be typical in a style like that and just doing them and avoiding, like the plague, like COVID-19, any harmonic progression that doesn't sound standard. So if I was playing that, right, I'm probably not then going to just immediately go off some super distant key. Or if I did, that would be a very strong choice to make, and I'd have to back it up later. The classical performers like Mozart and Haydn also had this massive repertoire of ornaments, not just, but like whole passages, whatever, just things that they could, plan and just let it go. I honestly don't have the patience to learn all of those historical patterns. Not interested in it. For me, it's a much more interesting question to try to see what I can do with all of the musical elements that have come after that as well, like jazz and licks that Rachmaninoff wrote in his music, or that Prokofiev and Shostakovich and Shevsky, Kabalevsky, all of these different composers have come up with since then. It's not to diminish it. I think it's great that people do that, but for me, I just don't have the time or the patience really to sit down and figure all this out. But that's a very long-winded answer to how do you improvise a Mozart cadenza. I think know the style, know the texture, and know the harmonic progression, and just play with it at home.
You have a question here from Dominica. What age did you start making improvisation?
Yeah. Probably I was like, oh my gosh, I was probably like 8 or 9. But if you're not 8 or 9, you can start now. It's fine. Or if you are 8 or 9, I don't know
where
you are.
Age
if I can see you.
Start.
Okay. Yeah. You can just, I know a lot of people who have gotten into it very late in life. And the good news is that I don't really think you need to do anything special. It's just a matter of listening to the sounds that you're already making on the instrument and trying to figure out a new way to do them. So a couple of great exercises that you can do if you're brand new to improvisation and just starting out. Bach, by the way, did this in most of his preludes to, I won't say most, but many of his preludes that he wrote, is you just find a chord progression and you play it in a bunch of different styles. So here's one chord progression. This is the one that Bach uses all the time. So that's the texture. To do this over and over again. We can play it in texture too. What about a different time, like a saraband, a dance in 3? Basically the same chord progression. It's just elaborated in a different context. Well, what about something that sounds a little bit more like Mendelssohn or something? Progression, and it's even really the same patterns within each improvisation, but just again finding different contexts and different ways of doing that. I guarantee you, even though it sounds very flashy and fancy, that many of you could go home right now and play this in 2 or 3 different styles. If you wanted to play it as a whole. The doorway to improvising. And then once you have those patterns and you become more familiar with recombining them, you can do pretty much anything and get away with it. So, Alard asks, how do you relate the keys and the emotions? That's a good question. I think that for me, it's just like I always spend about an hour or two a day improvising. And over time, you kind of get a sense for what works and what doesn't. But also, I love to steal things from composers. Um, and one of the things you can do is if you have a piece of music and there's a really great moment, you're like, oh, I just love that. That's my favorite thing. Then you can try to figure out why that works the way it does. So one of those for me recently comes from this saxophone sonata, and it starts like this. And it's just a great sound. Oh, why is that now? Why do I like that so much? And so I sat down to figure out what it is. It's the D7 and then E7 together. Of course, now around the piano, you do fine. You can do it in a different key. Do it in a different texture. And so, as you begin to develop fluency as an improviser, you can manipulate these different emotional states. And the biggest way to do it is just to study composed music. And whenever you see something that really you respond to, you just try to figure out a way to make it your own. It's a very like that sounds like a very hippie answer, but I think I think it's honestly the truth. Um, any more questions? I really appreciate you guys asking questions, by the way, because I was like, oh, I should definitely make a lot of this presentation questions. Let me ask you guys a question. Has anybody there had any experience improvising before? Like, I saw it on the schedule that someone later is scheduled to talk about it, so I thought maybe I would drop in for that if I can. But are there any others? I'm just curious. Maybe so. While you guys think on that, I'll answer this other question. How did you decide, or how did you get inspired by playing the piano? Um, I started playing when I was really young. I was 4 when I started playing the piano. Um, and for me, it was something that was always a part of my life. Um, we have talked a lot about improvising, and so it feels sort of cheap to say that that's one of the things that has always kept me interested in the piano. But also, I just love the experience of performing for people. I think that it's one of the things that just brings me the most joy in life is to play music for other people. Um, and the amazing thing about music is how it can express ideas and bring people together, um, but without expressing something specific, without expressing it in words. Um, and I think that like as I've gotten older, I've become more and more aware of how important that is. It seems cheap to say like, oh, music is the universal language, or it's the thing that we can all agree on, across national boundaries and things like that. I think that it's actually deeper than that. I think it's just something that makes us human, and so when we celebrate it together, it's a way of just coming together as people, and experiencing something beautiful and remarkable together. So I always, whenever I kind of have like a crisis of faith, or if I ask myself like, why am I playing the piano? What am I doing? I think that that's something that always brings me some comfort and satisfaction, knowing that it's really worthwhile. I think making music is one of the um, most important things that we can do as people. It doesn't have to be something that you do professionally either, but people who have a profound respect for music, I think, just see the world a little differently because of it. So I think it's one of the best things that you can do, and that's what keeps me inspired playing the piano. Why do you think there are few variations in most classical sonatas? That's an interesting question. Raphael, maybe you can unmute yourself and explain yourself. No, but I'm just curious to know, do you mean like variation form, or do you mean variation within the structure of the, like the texture mostly stays the same, or what do you mean by variation, I guess? You can always type it in too if you want. Anyway, while I wait for him to do that, I think it really depends. I think that some, like okay, so in Mozart and Beethoven, for example, I mean, they did incorporate some variation form. I think the challenge, so what makes a sonata a sonata? We have to start there. A sonata is basically a journey from one, the tonal area of one, to five, and then eventually a long time later back to one. There are always themes associated with these key areas. That's really hard to do in variation form, because in variation, you're always stating the same thing over and over again. So it's hard to make these large scale transformations happen. You do, however, see some examples of it. I'm struggling to think of one where it combines sonata and variation form in Mozart and Beethoven, but there certainly are sonatas with variation movements in them. They're especially common as last movements. But I think that's probably the simplest answer to the question, that sonata form is mostly about taking a very long journey from beginning to middle to end. And then variation form is more about like these smaller scale units and how they relate to each other. But the interesting thing is, you do see this later in music, like in the Liszt sonata, which is about half an hour long, and one very, very long sonata form movement, but it also combines elements of variation form, because all of the themes are recombined in different ways, and they come back in completely different textures. And that's one reason why that's such an important piece of music, because it does actually combine those elements together. I think probably the simplest answer to that question is, it's really, really hard, and it took a long time in the evolution of the sonata form for someone to be able to do it really successfully. There's one question in Spanish that maybe Carlos can help me with, because my Spanish is pretty much limited to.
Yes, it's Roberto Carlos. He said, what is free improvisation? And how it described emotions. Then, maybe he's trying to say something. What is free improvisation, and how it has to relation between improvisation and description of emotions, and maybe how you can describe improvisation of free character, free improvisation, you know?
Yeah.
You understand?
I think so. It's also, it's made a little trickier by the fact that free improvisation has a couple of different meanings in English. So
maybe
there's
with any style, maybe.
Sure. Yeah.
No more, not anything.
Right. If what you want to call today's improvisations was free improvisation, then yeah, that's fine. I think like, so wait, the question, just to make sure that I'm answering this right, the question is basically how do emotions relate to free improvisation, or how do you get, or does it always have to be that way? What can you just clarify? I don't know.
Quizás Roberto, ¿puedes explicarnos un poquito más qué es lo que quieres decir con tu pregunta? ¿Puedes escribirla quizás?
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes. Hace unos años yo estuve en una un taller de improvisación libre,
Ok,
pero este tipo de improvisación
dame un segundo para ir diciéndole a
ya,
Will. He's talking about he was in a course of free improvisation. Okay, continue.
Nice.
Okay. ¿Qué más, Roberto?
ahora eh, quizá, no sé, el concepto de la música mediante la improvisación libre que vi en el curso pueda ser distinta a lo que se está dando en la conferencia actual ahorita. No obstante, quería ver, pero como que he visto, he estado, digamos, como quien dice, tomando nota de lo que estamos viendo en la conferencia de ahorita, tomaron como títulos como el jazz, la música tradicional, y vi de lo que decía improvisación libre. Improvisación libre, entre lo que yo pude aprender, ¿no? Con el maestro Massini era como que trabajar tímbricamente con los instrumentos, pero ya más allá de la armonía, o sea, tipo John Cage, por así decirlo, ¿no? O sea, ya demasiado, digamos, tanto así de que luego de la experiencia tú sales a la calle y todo lo que escuchas ya es música, por así decirlo, ¿no?
Ok, ok.
Porque ya
Dame un minuto para explicarle un poco a lo que
a
quiere
ver,
decir. He's trying to say,
tiene que ver, a
yeah,
ver,
about timbric. The instrument, timbre of the timbre is the sound of the instrument. You know,
Yeah.
it's not about the style or the structure. It's about the sound of the instrument.
Yes.
For him,
Yeah.
for his.
No, I agree with you actually about that. I think that, and that's one of the interesting things is I was exploring the different ways that I could play, and you guys could hear about the same sound that I was hearing. I always find that the sound, the timbre, and the and just the character of the instrument is almost as much a determinant of the results of improvisation as whatever intention I have when I sit down to do it. And I think that's particularly true if you look at the improvisers of like the 1960s and the 1970s, the people who really began this movement of free improvisation. People like Ornette Coleman, Gunther Schuller, others from around the same era. I guess Frederick Shevsky probably. Some of the Italians working in Rome around that time, and composers as well in Germany. Were fascinated with just finding different approaches to timbre, and the music that they came up with was quite chaotic at times. I mean, it was not at all. It was actually a savage break with the past in terms of any relation to tonal harmony or the practice of Western composers for hundreds of years before, which is fine. It was an incredible creative movement. I personally, because my background is in performance and not in composition, I personally respond more to approaches that consider the performer as much as they do the composer. And I think that some of these composers, because their music is so difficult to approach, except as really a free improviser or as a composer, because they come from that different standpoint. It becomes really difficult for me personally, to relate to them in the same way. I hope that kind of answers your question. I think that as time has gone on, I've gotten more and more interested in the possibilities of free improvisers who really are just playing like entirely new sounds on the instrument, and they really don't relate to composition in any way, which is kind of the opposite of what this lecture is allegedly about, about composing in real time. I think that there are these amazing creative possibilities for almost uncomposing in sound, where you are making sounds and putting them against each other without any real expectation of a compositional process coming out of that. But again, because I have so many years of training as a classical musician and as a classical performer, where everything is about composition, I always am a little tempted to apply principles of composition as well to even my freer improvisations.
I have a question for you. Do you think it's important to have an structure in mind in order to improvise?
I think it depends. I think it can be. I don't think it's very satisfying. For example, if I tell you, I think it all has to do with the expectation between the listener and the performer. Like if I tell you, I'm going to tell you a story. This crazy thing happened to me the other day. I went down to the store. And okay. Anyway, what do you want to do later? Like, it's just very, if it doesn't have a structure with a beginning and an end and some kind of payoff, then you feel disappointed as a listener. But if you're just playing at home, I don't think you need anything. And I think a lot of the practice of improvising is just getting used to playing without a clear expectation for the immediate future. Like if I just am here, hanging out, and then I put my hands down up here, and I just try to justify these two sounds. I don't have a plan, but a skillful improviser can take these kind of raw materials and gradually shape them into something that resembles a story, or not. And then that can be almost as exciting as setting up an expectation and actually deliver.
It's like something born from or grow from the chaos, maybe, like something new is coming from chaos at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. And the funny thing is, talk to like old guys who have been improvising for like 50 years or something. Like I met this amazing performer who came to our university last year. He's one of the world's like best known improvisers from that group of people I was just talking about in the 1960s who were like really far out there. Like 8 people came to his performance, and it was the most atonal sounding music I have ever heard in my life. Like it was very difficult, even for me as like a pretty open-minded musician, to listen to a lot of it. But he was like, the thing that I realized after like 20 years of improvising was I knew what I was going to play the next time that I put my hands on the keyboard. I knew exactly what that was going to sound like. And I had to try to figure out a way to surprise myself, because that surprise is what it is, the creative language of improvising. Like that not quite being sure, that's what makes it exciting. So, yeah.
Here,
the chaos principle. Okay, this person says, how did you get yourself to start improvising? In my case, I wanted to begin improvising, but I was very insecure because I didn't know how to continue. Yes, I understand that. And left it behind. How can you inspire yourself to continue and pursue with what you improvise in order to make it a composed piece? That's an interesting question. I mean, for me, I struggle a lot to compose because it's rarely as rewarding as just improvising something. I think Chopin probably can sympathize too. It's like, because apparently he struggled with it a lot too. I will say that with the technology of 2020, there is amazing potential in terms of, if you have a keyboard, for example, a digital keyboard, you can plug it into your computer and record as MIDI everything that you play. And then even if it's not arranged in time exactly as it would be on a page, you still have the harmonies and you still have the musical timing preserved. And if you want, you can go back and make any improvisation immediately into a fully developed piece of music. But I think some of it too is just, for me, one of the reasons why I always keep coming back to improvisation in my life is because there are still very few expectations from audiences and from performers alike. It's a relatively new area. There isn't a lot of, most piano professors, for example, won't try to teach you how to improvise. And so it's something that's very personal. It's something that can evolve with time. And you can spend your whole life and just improvise for yourself if you want. So, what I would encourage you to do is just, the next time that you're playing a piece of music and something really catches your eye, like maybe it's a chord or maybe it's a phrase or something, try to figure out how it works. Try to see if you can make something that's different. or if you can continue that musical idea in a different way than the composer then did it. And that can be a really powerful way to unlock ideas that are already in your head that you didn't know about. And maybe even abilities as a pianist or as a performer on another instrument that you weren't aware of. A question that I ask myself a lot if I get stuck in an improvisation is like, let's say I'm playing something and it kind of sounds like Debussy. I'll ask myself, well, if this was a Debussy piece that I was playing, what would he write next? And try to play that. Or, you know, if this was a Bach piece, like what would Bach write next? And what's my expectation? And then I can either do that or I can do something different. But either way, it's a clear next step and you don't feel like, oh, I just don't know what I'm doing. It doesn't ever sound right. It's very frustrating and I'm always disappointed, you know? Yeah. Cool. Any more questions?
Josué is...
I completely relate with it doesn't ever sound right. Yeah. You know, I, for years, was frustrated that everything that I played and everything I improvised sounded like just triads to me. Like all I could ever hear was like really ugly parallel triads, like that have progression. And then I decided, you know what? That's just what my improvising sounds like. I'll probably try my whole life to get away from that, and it will always be there. So why don't I just embrace it? Why don't I try to find something that works with that? So I'm not just fighting myself all the time in my own music. And, you know, maybe you can find something similar for yourself like that. Either way, at this point, like music has come so far, there are no rules anymore. You can either be really, really daunted by that and like put off and kind of anxious, or you can just embrace it and go with it, you know? And the beauty of improvisation is it brings some of that into the realm of, I think, the really careful study that we do as classical musicians as well. Cool. Well, thank you all so much. I hope that this has at least piqued your interest. If you have more questions, you can always
Excuse me, I have a question.
Carlos. Yeah.
Learning improvisation helps you to improve your performance, your piano performance?
That's a very good question. Honestly, I want to say yes, because it's always been a big part of my life, but I'm not totally sure that it's always a one-to-one thing. Like, it's definitely made me a better composer. I would go that far. But the funny thing is, I think it actually makes it more difficult to memorize music, or at least it has for me. I'll give you an example. So I've been working on memorizing a really large program that you'll hear some of in the next couple of days. And before that, I had spent a lot of time working on improvisation for a performance. And so I had a couple of months where I was trying to sort of change gears in my mind from like the improvising brain to the, you know, concert pianist brain. And what I found, there was a moment where I realized I was practicing these pieces as if I was still improvising. So I would play something and then I would immediately think back to that and then try to play one or two steps ahead, which kind of works in like Liszt, but it doesn't really work in Bach because the music is so detailed and because you can't always, Bach is just too smart. Like you can't play in that short range. You have to have like a larger structure that you're hanging it on. So, you know, I had to take a step back and go, okay, I'm thinking about this music as if I was improvising it. I need to think about it as if I'm just totally can't play the piano unless I already know what the entire piece of music sounds like. That being said, like, I think that if you're fluent as an improviser, and if you're familiar with different musical styles and you're able to play freely in those styles, it opens amazing doors in terms of interpretation and adding expression to pieces of music that you play. Because if you think about it, yeah, there's a lot of elements in composition that are prescribed that we can't change, like the notes, for example. You can't really change, like you can't just add a whole big improvised passage in a Beethoven sonata and expect people to take it that seriously. But, you know, Beethoven didn't tell you how exactly fast to play every single phrase in a sonata, or he didn't tell you how to shape a phrase necessarily, or there are all of these musical elements that are not totally, that are really improvised from performance to performance. So I think the more fluent you are as an improviser, the more expressive potential it gives you as a pianist. So yeah, it's a mixed bag though. Definitely, definitely, it's like any musical skill. It kind of is its own thing that you have to work on by itself. Like, you know, sight reading isn't necessarily going to make you a better memorizer of music, but memorizing isn't necessarily going to make you better at sight reading. And unfortunately, or fortunately, as pianists, we have to kind of do all of it. So yeah, good luck. Yeah, it's funny how that works. Cool. Anyone else? Can I, since we've been talking for like an hour and a half, can I just play something for you guys? And then if you think of any more questions, you can let me know, and I'll be happy to answer them either by email. And again, I'm sorry that this is not totally an ideal situation. I hope I can actually play something and hear it. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But either way, thank you very much for listening, and hope you enjoy. Thanks very much. Thank you again, Carlos, for having me. What an amazing break this was from being locked up inside for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. Hopefully, in the very near future, we'll be free to make music for each other again in person, and I'll be able to make a trip down to Peru and see you all face to face. That would be amazing.
Thank you so much.
Stay tuned for the recital. I think we're going to do that asynchronously, right? So I'll just record it and then send it to you.
2 weeks. Yeah, in 2 weeks is going to be your recital.
Cool.